All right, so we've learned a lot about CSS transitions. Let's now try and make something with them. What we'll do is take an image gallery that I've already created for us, a basic image gallery that doesn't have any effects, and we'll add some simple animated hover effects. So let me show you what that will look like. Here's the completed version. We only have 3 images in this case, but as I hover over them, you'll see there's a couple things that happen. I'll break it down in just a moment, but essentially we have an icon that appears and then a color as well, overlay. But there's actually more behind the scenes that you may not be aware of at first glance. So we're going to implement these transitions. There's a couple different components like I mentioned. So I've broken it down here. There are 3 basic pieces. There's a background div that's behind the image that you actually don't see when the page loads. And then there's the image that goes on top. And then finally, there's an icon that's on top of both of those. So what we're doing is hiding the icon and then showing it when the user hovers. And at the same time, we're actually changing the opacity of the image so that you see the underlying color. So this fades a bit and we see that red. So let me show you one more time. So the icon appears and the image dims, or actually it doesn't dim, the opacity changes. So we can see some of that red behind, or in this case, some of the blue behind, or the teal green color behind. So that's the basics, but there's a couple things that this example will actually allow us to do that I think are a little bit more fun than just regular transitions. And if you're at all curious about these images, these are 3 that I've taken. Photography is sort of a hobby of mine, so I sometimes try and include my photos in the course. So 3 photos, but that's not that important. And underlying them, there's a div for each one. So if I comment out one of these images, let's take this one and save, you can see behind it, there's a blue div. And the same here, there's a red one, and there's a green one behind this image. Then we have the image on top, and then on top of that, there is an icon. The icons are done with Font Awesome. If you're not familiar with that, it's an awesome library that has a ton of different pre-done icons that you can reference and use by just importing Font Awesome, which I do right here up top, and then referencing FA- whatever the name of the icon is. In my case, I did camera, paw, and a cloud. So we have those 3 components, and each one of them are inside of a div called item. So that item div is one photo plus a background behind it plus the icon. So there are 3 different items. Okay, so a couple things you might notice. First of all, this icon seems like it's not in the middle, so we will address that with our animation and with the scale. But let's start off with something easy. When we hover over one of these images, why don't we change the opacity so we can start to see that color behind it, just like we do here. So to do that, it's just a simple hover. So let's scroll down. I'll make this a bit bigger as well. And I'll go down, just do it at the very bottom for now. So we'll do div.item, so all items, when they are hovered over, change the image and make the opacity 0.3. Now, when I hover, you can see that we're getting that color from behind. So that's the very first thing. There's no transition yet, but that's the first property to change. So let's add in a basic transition. I'll start by adding a very quick 0.35 second transition to everything in the item div. So just sort of a catch-all. So the reason I'm doing this is we're going to animate the opacity here as well as the icon, which is also inside of this item div. So I can affect them all with a single transition. But I need to use this star because if I just say div.item and I add a transition in here, let's say transition, I'll do something very obvious first. 1 second, ease in, out, and I'll do it for all properties. That doesn't affect our hover because the opacity change is happening on the image. It's not happening to the item, even though the image is inside of the item. So if we want it to happen, we want the transition to apply to everything inside the item div, which includes the image and the icon. Well, in that case, we'll save, use this star, and now it takes a second for that transition to happen. And then once we start applying things to or effects to our icons, those will also take a second. But of course, we don't want them to stay 1 second long, but I'll keep it there for now, just so that it's easy for us to see what's happening. Okay, so another small note that you may not have noticed. If you take a look at the end state of this animation, so where we're seeing the red through, and you compare it to the end state of this one, notice that the image is a lot duller. We can't see those bright colors popping through like we can here. So this is a choice that I made, and a common choice that you'll see. You can actually make this image grayscale at the same time as you're changing the opacity. And a lot of people like that effect, that the gray out effect kind of draws your focus away from the image and towards the icon. It makes the icon stand out more. So that's really simple to do. There's actually a property called filter, and we can just do grayscale is the filter, 100%. So not something that we've seen in the course, but a fun little property. And actually, if I just do grayscale, you'll see what happens when I hover. All that color goes away. And on its own, that's actually kind of a cool effect. You might prefer just to leave it like that and have the icon be colored. Totally up to you. But I'm going to also add that opacity. So you can see now that we get the red, but all those other colors are gone. So let me comment it out. Here, I'll hover over it, comment that line out, and save. You can see now the color is back. And if I uncomment it, the color goes away. So not mandatory, but a nice little thing to know that you can do. Okay, so we have our 1 second transform. Let's make it 0.5 seconds for now, so it's a little faster. So now we're going to conquer the icon. And let's talk about how it actually works. So if we focus here, as I hover, it happens pretty quickly, but the icon doesn't just appear out of nowhere, it doesn't fade in. It actually scales up from the center. So, and as I hover away, you'll see it shrink down and then scale up. So what do you know? We know how to do that using transform scale. So that's what we'll be doing. We'll start it off as hidden by using scale set to 0. So by scaling something to 0, it doesn't show up, but it allows us to animate it to scale of 1 when we hover. And that will give us this growing effect and then the shrinking effect when the hover ends. So let me show you. If I scroll down here and add in a div.item hover, just like before, but this time we'll target the icons inside of the item, because we want this effect to trigger when I hover anywhere over the item, not just where the icon is. So to do that, we don't put the hover on the icon, we put the hover on the item. And what we'll change here is do a transform scale 2. And you can see it's growing. Now this isn't what we want. In fact, what we actually want is for it to start at scale 0 and end at scale 1. Right now we're going from 1 to 2. So I'll leave it at that for now, transform scale 2. But what we need to do is change that initial scale. So that's div.item icon. And I'm pretty sure I have that up here somewhere else. But I'm going to write it, yeah, I do. I'm going to write it separately so you can just see the new code separate from the starter code. So it would be a better practice in the completed code to combine these, so I'm not duplicating selectors, but I'm not going to do that here just for clarity's sake. And all we'll do is set the transform to initially be scale 0. And you'll see they go away. And now when I hover, they're growing to scale 2, so let's change that to be scale 1. And we're getting that effect. Yes, it's still in the wrong place, but we're getting close. So what we've done is set scale 0 as the initial state, and it's going to scale 1 when we hover. And remember that transition right now is coming from here, where we added this div.item star, all properties anywhere inside of an item on anything inside, whether it's an image or an icon, should take half a second, ease in, out. So the next thing we should do is move the icon to the middle. And it's actually very simple in our case. What we can do is just add to the transform, translate it using %, -50%, -50%. We want to move it 50% up and to the left. And you might think that that's enough, but actually if I hover, it looks like it's not working. But the reason is that it is translating -50, -50 when it's not showing up because scale is 0. But then when we hover, we just set scale back to 1. And if you remember from our transform videos earlier on, if you reassign transform, it overwrites everything. So in this case, we're only assigning scale 1, so it's essentially deleting this part. So what we can do is just copy that down here and add that in as well, so that at both points it's translated, so it's moving it over and scaling it to 0 at the beginning, and then when we hover, it stays moved over and it scales it to 1. Now it works. So now we have the basics done. All that's left is if you wanted to tweak it to match some of the more fancy timing that I included. So rather than making you watch me type the whole thing, what I'm going to do is just copy some of the timing in. So here we have a curve and a transition, as well as a delay, actually 100 milliseconds, that affects when we hover over the item, it affects the icon. So basically this transform. And rather than doing all, we could just make this transform because that's the only property that's changing on the icon. So now as I hover, see if you can notice that, it grows a bit and then shrinks back down a tiny bit. So if I made that a full second, it might be easier to see. Save again. See, there we go. So it grows a little too far and then comes back, and that's because of this curve here. But I'll go back to 300 milliseconds. So notice though, when I hover away, we still have that same effect from before. We don't have this fancy cubic Bezier curve where it grows and then shrinks. What we actually have is just the initial transition that's being set right here. So we can change that if we wanted to. This is only impacting when we hover. It doesn't impact when we leave. So what we can do is go to div.item_i, so the same thing except without the hover. And whatever we put here will happen after the hover. So let me fix this up to be transform as well, so we're more specific. But let's say I made this 1 second long. You'll see that when we hover is still only 300 milliseconds, but then as I leave, it takes a second. And we get a very similar transition. There we go. So I'm going to leave that, except turn it back to 300 milliseconds without the delay. So that delay, I'm not well versed in the psychology behind this, but I believe that I read something somewhere a long time ago that having things feel too fast or too slick sometimes can be a worse experience. Obviously, you don't want long load times or anything, but in this case, a tiny delay of 100 milliseconds on this icon makes it feel a little more natural. But we don't have a delay on the color and the grayscale that's happening, and that's fine. And the very last thing, if you want, you can make this a little bit faster. And now we have the same effect that I had in the initial solution code. Of course, tweak this however you'd like, play around with these curves. You know, people don't just come up with these sort of curves out of nowhere. Most of the time they're using an editor like the ones that I've shown you before. So if that's something that you are curious about and you're more inclined to actually create your own, definitely try that out. Use one of those easing tools. I think that one was called Caesar, and it allows you to draw a chart, a graph, and it will convert it to the appropriate quadratic curve. All right. So hopefully you can see that transitions are useful. You know, we didn't have to do anything crazy. We really only have a couple of transitions here on a couple of properties. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed building that. Now we're moving on to another type of animation, just called animations.